This is the Octa Mundi Miracula, a set of 8 engravings dating to the late 16th century. It is the first modern compilation of what we, today, know as the 7 wonders of the ancient world, with the 8th here being the Colosseum. Probably the earliest record we have of what would later be considered to be the wonders of the ancient world comes from the writings of Herodotus, and slightly after him, the conquests of Alexander, and thus the start of the Hellenistic period, resulted in different lists of magnificent structures that travelers could go and see, and these early lists ranged from the ones we think of today to many others, such as the tomb of Cyrus, the Pergamon altar, and the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus. The earliest grouping of 7 wonders, at least that we have surviving, is from a fragment of a poem written by Antipater of Sidon, which dates to around the 1st century BC. His list includes the fortification walls of Babylon, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Hanging Gardens, the Colossus of Rhodes, the pyramids at Giza, the tomb of Mausoleum, and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. There are other lists of 7 wonders, but the Octa Mundi Miracula essentially takes Antipater's list and swaps out the walls of Babylon for the Lighthouse of Alexandria, and from the late 16th century we get our official, modern list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. All but one of them, however, the pyramids at Giza, are long since gone. This video will explore what happened to them, and it is partially inspired by the fact that, in July of 2025, 22 massive blocks from the lighthouse were hauled out of Alexandria's harbor. The 3 main pyramids at Giza consist of the Great Pyramid, built by the pharaoh Khufu, constructed in the 27th century BC, the Pyramid of Khafre, Khufu's son, constructed in the 26th century BC, and the Pyramid of Menkaure, also constructed in the 26th century BC. Of the 7 ancient wonders, the pyramids are by far the oldest, outclassing the next oldest, the Hanging Gardens, by about 2 millennia. Today, the Great Pyramid stands at a height of 138 meters, but it was even more impressive during Old Kingdom Egypt, when it stood at a height of 147 meters. Despite surviving for so long, however, the pyramids do not dominate the Giza Plateau in all of their original glory. They were, initially, encased in gleaming white limestone. The majority of that casing stone is supposed to have been loosened due to an earthquake in 1300, and it was then taken by the Sultan of the Mamluk Empire to construct mosques and other buildings in their capital city of Cairo. This is in addition to millennia of erosion, which then means that during the classical period, they still would have been white. The second of the 7 wonders, the famed Hanging Gardens of Babylon, is separated from the pyramids by about 2 millennia. Interestingly enough, the poem of Antipater does not specify which Hanging Gardens he had chosen to include, because there was another, the Hanging Gardens of Thebes in Egypt, mentioned by Pliny the Elder in his Natural History. Many other sources do mention that the Hanging Gardens are the structure at Babylon though, so we can reasonably be sure that Antipater probably had this one in mind. Either way, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon comprise the next on the modern list. The interesting thing about this particular wonder, however, is the debate around whether or not they actually existed. It's the only one of the 7 wonders that has not been confirmed. Assyrian sources tell us that Assyrian kings built large, well-maintained gardens, so it's not like a massive garden in Babylon is without any sort of precedent. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were supposed to have been a multi-tiered structure built by the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, and which was constructed for his wife, Amytis, who was homesick for the lush valleys of her homeland. The gardens were supposedly built along the banks of the Euphrates, and river water was constantly pumped in to irrigate the plants and to create magnificent waterfalls. The problem is that we do not have Babylonian sources which describe the gardens, and all of our records are from significantly later. We may actually have one single Babylonian source, the writing of a priest named Berosus, dating to the early 3rd century BC, who was cited by Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, a gap of about 400 years. So this has led to several competing ideas about the garden and whether or not they existed. The first is that they just never existed in the first place. What later Greek and Roman sources called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon might have been inspired by Assyrian gardens, but it's really just a fantasy. The second is that the gardens were destroyed at some point after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar during the many centuries of war that carved up Babylonian territory, and during which the city was repeatedly attacked. The last theory is that due to the construction of gardens by Assyrian kings, the reality behind the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is that they were inspired by a real set located in Nineveh, built by the king Sennacherib about 100 years before Nebuchadnezzar II. We do actually have some archaeological evidence of the canals and irrigation systems at the city, which served as an inspiration, and at some point, so this theory goes, the location of the gardens was swapped into Babylon in the textual record. With the next of the seven wonders, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, we are back on solid footing. It did in fact exist, and unlike the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, we probably know what happened to it. Rediscovered in 1869, the temple was constructed in 550 BC for certain, and it was dedicated to a particular version of Artemis that was known in the classical world as a fertility deity that was the patron goddess of Ephesus. There was an earlier temple on the same site, constructed during the Bronze Age and which was apparently destroyed by a flood during the 7th century BC. The Bronze Age foundations for the first temple correspond to between the 10th and the 8th centuries BC, and there does appear to have actually been a flood, evidenced by a layer of debris, including sand, about a half-meter thick deposited on top of the first temple. The second temple was dedicated specifically to Artemis, and digging has revealed that it has a foundation which was infused with hundreds of items, notably coins, and the temple is supposedly the first one constructed of marble. This second temple met its end due to being burned by a man named Herostratus in 356. Supposedly, the Ephesians banned anybody from speaking his name, although it's thanks to one writer, Theopompus, that we know of Herostratus. The Ephesians began to rebuild it, and during his conquest of Persia, Alexander apparently offered to rebuild the temple, covering all of the cost himself, and although he was rebuffed, a third temple was eventually constructed on the spot. It is this third temple that comprises the third of the seven wonders, and it was even bigger than the previous iteration. So what happened to it? Well, it's supposed to have been sacked by Goths in 262, after having been struck by at least one earthquake, but that has been called into question because it comes from the writings of Jordanes, a source that's not always reliable, and which constructs a monumental history of the Goths, which sees them involved in everything from Egypt during the time of the pharaohs to the burning of Rome in 410. We do know that Theodosius I closed the temple in 391, and the Archbishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, is supposed to have ordered the temple to be burned at some point between 397 and 403, but even if that's not the case, Theodosius did order it to be shut down. All that remains today, however, are a handful of ruins, so it's not outside the realm of possibility that a Christian mob in late antiquity did set fire to it. The fourth of the seven wonders was the statue of Zeus at Olympia, a religious sanctuary honored by all Greeks and controlled by the city-state of Elea. Elea's great rival was Athens, and attempting to surpass them in glory, they contracted Phidias, the sculptor who constructed the massive Athena Parthenos, to build a monumental statue of Zeus in a temple dedicated to the god at Olympia. The statue, which stood over 12 meters high, falls into a category of statues popular in ancient Greece called chryselephantine statues, meaning that it was made from a combination of gold and ivory. Unfortunately, no models of the statue have survived, but we do have images on coins, and our most detailed description comes from Pausanias' description of Greece, which tells us that the statue was cloaked in a robe made of glass. His right hand held a statue of Nike, while his left hand held a scepter topped with an eagle, and around his head was a crown made of olive branches. The throne was made of wood, decorated with metal and jewels, and massive golden sandals covered the statue's feet, beneath which was a stool decorated with the Amazonamaki. In front of this was a reflecting pool which held olive oil that was used to coat the statue and prevent damage from environmental conditions. We do not, unfortunately, know the fate of the statue of Zeus. It's known that it still existed when Theodosius closed all of the temples in 391, and, like the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the temple at Olympia fell into disrepair. There seem to be three possibilities. The first is contained in a line from the writer Lucian, dating to the 2nd century, which implies that the temple was attacked and attempted to be looted. The second is that it was destroyed when the temple burned in 425, and the third is that the statue was packed up, moved somewhere, and possibly lost. In the end, unfortunately, we just don't know. Mausolus, head of the Carian dynasty and king of Halicarnassus, ruled between 377 and 353 BC, alongside his sister and queen Artemisia II. He was a Persian satrap, and the mausoleum was supposedly constructed by Artemisia between 353 and 351 after her brother died, although those 2 years have been called into question. It is highly unlikely, given the ornateness of the structure, that it was built in only 2 years. More probably, Mausolus began construction during his own lifetime, and it was continued after his death by Artemisia. Taking inspiration from Lycian tombs, notably the tombs of Xanthos, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus was about 45 meters in height, and it was so richly adorned that it became known throughout the Greek world. Interestingly enough, within the ruins of the mausoleum, a jar, known today as the Jar of Xerxes I, was discovered. It's not clear what this was for, but one idea is that, because Artemisia I was an admiral during the Second Persian invasion of Greece, that this was a gift filled with water from the Nile to symbolize close ties between the Persians and the Carians. Unlike the statue of Zeus, we have a better idea about what happened to this ancient wonder. We do know that it continued to be a destination during the Roman Empire, but an earthquake severely damaged the structure at some point, and in the late 15th century, most of the stone was taken by the Knights of St. John to fortify Bodrum Castle, and they took many of the statues and other artwork and kept them in that fortress. But in the time between the Muslim conquest of the Near East and the destruction of the mausoleum by the Knights of St. John, its fate is unfortunately much more murky. Next on the list is the Colossus of Rhodes, and here we run into a similar sort of problem that we encountered with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Colossus was constructed in 280 BC to celebrate the victory of the Rhodians over Demetrius the Besieger, using leftover siege equipment, notably from a massive siege tower. It collapsed due to an earthquake in 226 BC, and the Colossus was not rebuilt. Our surviving sources for this are all non-Rhodian, and they give slightly differing accounts for how big this ancient wonder really was. The most reasonable estimate seems to come from Pliny the Elder, who states that it was about 70 cubits, or about 32 meters tall. It continued to be an attraction for centuries after the 226 BC earthquake, and as for its fate, we don't really know. It is likely that it was melted down at some point, but we do not know when. There is one idea that it was converted into coins and weapons during the Arab conquests, but that comes from just one source, so in the end we don't know, and we quite possibly never will. That brings us to our last wonder of the ancient world, and the one responsible for creating the modern list: the Pharos Lighthouse, from the name of the island where it stood, otherwise known as the Lighthouse of Alexandria. It was mostly built during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, although construction began during the reign of his father, Ptolemy I Soter, making it the youngest of the 7 wonders. It took 12 years to complete, and it reached a height of 100 meters, being built mostly of sandstone, limestone, and granite, much of which was sourced from the Wadi Hammamat quarry near Alexandria. The tower was built in 3 distinct tiers. Level 1 was square, Level 2 was octagonal, and Level 3 was circular. At the top was a platform which featured a statue of Triton, son of Poseidon and god of the sea, at each corner, and on the roof of the platform was a statue of Poseidon. In the center was a gigantic mirror which reflected the light of the sun during the day, and during the night it reflected light from a fire that was kept burning. The lighthouse was damaged and ultimately destroyed by several earthquakes in 796, 951, 956, 1303, and 1323, but it was partially repaired after 956. There were, apparently, plans to rebuild the lighthouse during the Mamluk Sultanate, but it was abandoned, and the stones which had not fallen into the harbor were used, instead, to construct a fortress to defend Alexandria. There are actually some proposals to reconstruct the lighthouse in the modern day, but as of yet, nothing has come of them. So that's it. 6 of the 7 wonders of the ancient world are gone, lost to time. If nothing else, it reaffirms how fleeting so much of life really is, how fragile things really are, and I think Shelley's poem about Ramses II sums up how quickly the grandiose and the magnificent can fade into half-forgotten myth and legend, because no matter how hard we might try, nothing lasts forever.